34 right now. Next news at 9. Chicago's Morning Answer continues next on AM 560. The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I saw our next guest on Fox Business, and just thought he was really sharp and insightful on what's happening in Gaza and what can be done, first and foremost, to get American hostages returned to their families. His name is Alex Plitsas. He's an Army veteran. He's a board member of the Special Operations Association of America and a non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East Program's N7 Initiative. And he joins us now. Alex, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So when I saw you with Varney, you were talking a little bit about what you and your organization, which I understand is comprised of Special Forces veterans, are doing to try to help extract American hostages from Gaza. Can you explain that to our audience?
Sure. So it's not necessarily the hostages. It's more there are 500 to 600 American citizens who are trapped inside Gaza. That's in addition to the 10 or so folks who remain held hostage by Hamas inside Gaza. So our group, again, Special Operations Association of America, has been working with friends and colleagues over at Save Our Allies. We all came together for the Afghan evacuation. About 5 or 6 folks I worked with, we actually helped to run flights to support the State Department in the fall of 21 while they were waiting for the Qatari government to get up and running. And then we did evac rescue operations for citizens trapped in Ukraine. So we kind of fell into the space in 21 and have been working ever since. So through techniques developed, through some technology, some tradecraft, helping to navigate people remotely to safe locations while we can get to a point where we can actually pull them out. It's very difficult in Gaza because everything's kind of walled off at the moment, quite literally. So in the meantime, it's keeping everybody safe, moving them to safe locations, and coordinating with both the U.S., Israeli, and Egyptian governments, for their locations to make sure that they're safe, they're not going to be accidentally bombed, that type of thing. So we know the line.
Are there some Americans that are already at the border there near Egypt that are waiting to get out? Because NBC keeps showing Americans with passports saying we just let us out of here, please.
I mean, there's Americans kind of all over Gaza. We're specifically the ones that we're working with. We're not really going to talk about now just for their safety because there are still a target. But there's a good amount of Americans who are definitely ready to get out as soon as the gates are open.
Of the overall universe, how many Americans have not gotten to a place you would describe as a safe place for now until you can extract them? Just to give us a sort of sense of order of magnitude.
It depends. I can't prove a negative in terms of the folks we're not talking to, but I mean, the ones that we are, if you take that as an overall percentage representation of the population at large that we know is in Gaza, it's several hundred that are trapped in areas where they're not particularly safe at the moment.
I want to talk a little bit about how you describe the urban warfare that is coming. I've been using the metaphor you used of an anthill, but develop that for us. What do Israeli forces face when they enter Gaza and try to begin dismantling the Hamas terrorist infrastructure?
It's a great question. So people will kind of toss around different terms of what the Israelis are planning to do. I think they formulated it quite well in terms of what they're setting out to achieve to make sure it's realistic, right? The end state's a different story, but you can't defeat an ideology with bombs and bullets. So President Prime Minister Netanyahu said what they're setting out to do is to, quote, demilitarize Hamas. So again, you can't defeat ideology with bombs and bullets, but what you can do is you have to then go in, conduct a giant cordon and search, where you're going to have to go through the area methodically, section by section, building by building, and try to take away strategic weapons and infrastructure that would allow them to conduct an attack like that again. And that's going to take time. The tunnels, as you just mentioned, in terms of developing that a little further, there's between 50 and 100, not tunnels themselves, tunnel complexes, right? It is massive, 500 kilometers of tunnel under the ground where they've been storing weapons, food, water, everything else that they need to fight for years. So they can go on for months kind of as they are living in the subterranean, world that they've created, where allegedly, the command centers under Al-Shifa Hospital in central Gaza, They use civilian infrastructure to hide. And so the problem is you got to go in there and you got to go get it. So what they've been doing the last few weeks is what we call kinetic shaping operations. That's where they're going to launch airstrikes to try to take out as much infrastructure as they can from the air, trying to minimize civilian casualties to the extent possible, and then also try to take out the rockets that are still flying into Israel some 20-something days later, because they pose a threat to the civilian populace. Once they feel that they've done that to the extent possible, there'll be a full push on the ground into Gaza, absent any other political considerations.
And then what's to come of the hostages? I mean, I know Hamas had offered, hey, release our Palestinians and we'll release your hostages, but that's not going to happen.
No, I mean, well, first of all, I mean, I had oversight for hostage rescue operations and policy when I was at the Pentagon, so I've overseen a lot of cases over the years. This is by far the most complicated I've ever seen in my professional career. 200 people, 230 at this point, it sounds like, scattered all over the place in tunnel systems under the ground, potentially more than one group holding them, no confirmed intelligence as to where they all are, making simultaneous clandestine rescues virtually impossible, even if you could get access in the area. And the threat from small arms fire to helicopters, that kind of stuff, RPGs, picture like a Black Hawk Down scenario is a realistic threat, right? So that's not really something that's likely to see. You're basically looking either in negotiations or when the ground force comes in. And so, I mean, Hamas knew what they were doing. That's the one thing the hostage population should inform everybody who's listening, right? It wasn't like they took hostages from one small village somewhere in southern Israel where at the end of their rampage, the cell leader who was in charge of that particular group said, hey, let's grab some hostages, go back to Israel. They took them from all over southern Israel, which means there was a directive that was given ahead of time to take hostages. What does that tell us? It tells us Hamas knew how big and how dangerous this attack was going to be because they knew they were going to incur a massive Israeli response, and they knew that they're at a military disadvantage because they don't have armor, artillery, and air power. So they had to take something to try to mitigate the advantage the Israelis had, in this case was hostages. So it becomes a question if they're being used as human shields or actual bargaining chips. If they're bargaining chips, they should be safe somewhere, quiet, kept away from the fighting. If they're being used as human shields, then they're going to die in some, command center, where Hamas has kept them. I mean, at the end of the day, Hamas took them against their will and are holding them, and it is Hamas's responsibility to keep them safe and keep them out of areas where the Israeli military instead were conducting operations. That's Hamas's responsibility, not Israel's.
Well, how did that 19-year-old female soldier get out then? Because she was released yesterday.
Yeah, so she was being held as a one-off in one location because, again, we don't know where they all are. They, groups of twos and threes here or there, or they all off individually. That happened to be one particular area where they had intelligence where she was, and they're able to grab her, which is great. If they can continue to do so, that would obviously be incredible to free everyone. But like I said, this is not one of those situations where you've got a handful of hostages. We're talking, well over 200. So I think there's a chance we could see more of that. Special operations forces operating alongside conventional as they push into Gaza. But it's unlikely we're to see some sort of dramatic rescue that's going to somehow get all 200 plus out. It's going to be a combination of negotiations and then, targets of opportunity where they pop up to help rescue folks like yesterday, as you just described.
And so the unknown of whether they're using them as bargaining chips or human shields, the only way we'll learn the answer to that question is if Hamas either initiates some negotiation or responds to the initiation of negotiation for their release?
Yes, so there have been ongoing negotiations, and there still are in Doha and Qatar. So Qatar has been used as a state to help negotiations with the difficult actors. The Taliban had their office there for a long time. The U.S., still engages through the Taliban through the office in Doha. Hamas is kind of their leadership is hosted there. And so the Qataris have been hosting, peace talks or negotiations. They're not really peace talks, I guess, some combination thereof. And there was just reports that the head of Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, flew to Doha this past weekend. And so there's definitely ongoing negotiations. Prime Minister Netanyahu said as much. I think, they're digging in their heels for demands. I believe Hamas wanted, massive amounts of fuel brought in, and Israel said no. And so, a deal for some of the foreigners broke down. But there's also problems domestically in Israel from a political consideration, because if they're negotiating and all they're going to get out is the foreigners and the Israelis are stuck and they're all going to die, that doesn't really work either. So it's a very difficult situation given the number of actors involved.
Right, and so if they released all the hostages or a significant number of the Israeli hostages, then it makes them more susceptible to that ground invasion and makes it more likely that IDF would get down into those tunnels and fight it out, right, without concern for, I don't want to say it this way, but I don't know how else to say it, without concern for the hostages.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to take every opportunity they can to try to mitigate the risk to the hostages that are there. They're going to try to negotiate, but at the end of the day, right, you have Prime Minister Netanyahu was sitting in office, a guy who, by the way, has been running on a pro-security platform for a long time, was in charge for the single largest mass slaughter, execution, torture, and rape, in some cases burning them to death, of Jews since the Holocaust in a single day. It's like when everybody talks about the mindset of like being like 9/11, this was massive in terms of the impact to the Israeli population that was there. The vicious and heinous ways in which people were tortured and murdered has been unseen to date. And so he has a responsibility to protect his folks. And so people who are kind of saying, hey, there needs to be a ceasefire right now, that's just not how this is going to work. And here's why. It would be the equivalent, 2 weeks after 9/11, saying, all right, stop the missile launches in Afghanistan, with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They've got a legitimate concern about U.S. military presence in the Middle East. We should really just withdraw all of our troops and, not really go after them for what they did to us. Everybody in this call would look at us like you were crazy. There's absolutely no way. The Israelis are saying the same thing. You cannot expect us, after what happened, to not continue to persecute the end of this organization. But the question then becomes what happens afterwards, because there isn't a real clear post-governance plan, which is why General Petraeus came out and said, hey, be sure you understand the end state before you move in, because once you go in there and you clear everything out, Hamas isn't going to take back over. Israel's never going to allow it. The PLO and Fatah, which controls the West Bank, the other portion of the Palestinian territories, is saying they're not going back into Gaza on the backs of an Israeli tank. The Israelis saying they won't occupy or govern the space. So then who's in charge afterwards? Is it just a power vacuum? Somebody's going to need to rebuild and do reconstruction. You got 2.2 million Palestinians between the halfway point and the wall in Egypt right now, in areas that still have to be cleared. What do you do with those folks? There's a lot of open questions right now, and that's the reason the Arab states are all concerned, because they're worried the Palestinians are going to get permanently displaced into the Sinai. So this is still very much a regional powder keg.
Yeah, good description, and it's particularly with the unanswered questions that are, dizzying. Is there any play that could be made to try to draw them out of the tunnels? Is there any discussion or strategy that could be employed to do that, or to attempt to do that? Yeah, I mean, in theory you could, trying to pump, smoke or whatever else or things in there. There's different techniques for trying to clear the tunnels out, but the complex is just so massive, right? And in order to sustain air down there in a tunnel complex that massive, you have to have ventilation, electricity, everything else. So, we see what's happening now, right? There's been no food, very minimal food, water deliveries over the last 3 weeks, and people are somehow barely managing to cling on, with everything that's going. So there is no easy, quick way to push everybody out of those tunnels without putting hostages at risk should they be down there. And Hamas knows that. They're not stupid. That's the other reason. So, they took them for a reason.
Right. But doesn't Hamas have enough oil or gasoline and water and food for months, and they're just withholding it from the citizens?
Yeah, they have enough to sustain their force, because they've got, their force is estimated like 40,000. I don't know how many there actually are and how many have been killed now. But whatever they have in the tunnels, it's not enough for, 2.2 million people that are there. Doesn't mean they still shouldn't be bringing whatever they have up to the surface. But I meant that more in terms of the relation to the question about the tunnels, about, trying to get them out. They have what they need to survive down there. So unless you can flush them out using some sort of smoke, for lack of a better term, something like that, to get them out of there, some sort of chemicals, I don't know. But then what's legal under laws of warfare, and then also with the risk of the hostages. This is going to be a tough fight. This is going to be a very difficult one. And we also have, but let's not forget, Hamas has been sponsored by Iran for years. And we fought, I personally fought against the Shia-backed militias in Iraq in 2008. We've been fighting them for 20 years. So they have experience, watching the tactics, techniques, and procedures that Western forces use, and, how to booby trap houses, that kind of stuff. And we saw, wasn't widely publicized, but during the response to the attack on the 7th, a lot of very special Israeli operations units, top of the line, took significant casualties because they were ambushed and there was, booby traps left behind. It's very clear that they are learning from, 20 years of warfare, and this is going to be a very difficult fight.
He is Alex Plitsas, Army veteran, Special Operations Association of America board member, and non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East Program's N7 initiative. Alex, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's like a hot, steaming cup of information to start your day. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Signature Bank is Chicago's fastest growing independently owned business bank. It's a bank where relationships still matter. I'm Dan Proft, and I know this because Signature Bank is my